Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to do a deep dive on something happening right here in Colorado, Senate Bill 188. And, it's all about the state budget, but if we'll see, this goes way beyond, just numbers on a spreadsheet. This bill has caused people to wonder if the state is hiding funds and also if they have their priorities straight.
Yeah, it is fascinating because you have these cuts, right? Millions of dollars cut to programs that support at-risk children, and that's a huge issue, right? These are kids in need. And
Yeah.
at the same time, they're allocating funds for things like new furniture for the legislature. So it really kind of makes you think, where do our elected officials' priorities actually lie?
All right, so let's break down SB 188. It was passed on March 11th against the backdrop of a projected $1.2 billion shortfall in the state budget. So not exactly, chump change or anything. But here's where it gets really interesting and controversial. This bill makes a $3 million cut to programs that support at-risk children. Things like behavioral health services and foster care. I mean, these are vital services providing a safety net for kids who are facing, really, really tough situations.
And it's not just the immediate impact either. If you cut funding for these programs, it can have ripple effects that last for years. I mean, these kids are already facing an uphill battle, and, you take away these resources, that can mean they miss out on opportunities to really thrive and become successful adults.
And to make matters even more perplexing, the same bill that cuts funding for these essential services also gives $4 million for new furniture for the legislature.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to ignore that juxtaposition, and it's something that has fueled a lot of the public anger around SB 188. On the one hand, you have lawmakers talking about fiscal responsibility and, we have to tighten our belts. But then on the other hand, they're approving spending that a lot of people would say seems totally unnecessary and even frivolous.
No wonder people are saying that the Senate has the wrong priorities. But, we should understand what both sides are saying. So let's start with Governor Polis and the senators who support SB 88. Most of them are Democrats.
Yeah, and their main argument is that these cuts are difficult, but they're absolutely necessary to address this budget shortfall. And they point to, things like rising Medicaid costs and also the limitations of Tabor, which is Colorado's Taxpayer's Bill of Rights, which limits the state's ability to actually raise revenue.
And Governor Polis has also said a lot that the state has a $2.4 billion rainy day fund. And that shows, how responsible they are with managing finances. He says that this reserve is really important for making sure that things are stable in the long term and protecting the state from any kind of economic, shocks in the future.
But people who don't like the bill, like Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer, who is a Republican from Broomfield, say that this reserve is being hoarded across, all these different state-managed accounts, and they call it the 1,000 bank accounts problem.
So basically they're saying that the system makes it hard to understand how these funds are being managed and spent and that it lacks transparency. Kirkmeyer says that SB 188 actually makes oversight of these reserves even worse, which could give Governor Polis more ways to move funds around without having to answer to the public.
And Kirkmeyer doesn't stop there. She says that Polis could have used this $2.4 billion reserve, or at least the interest that it makes, to keep these children's programs going. Actually, in Polis's November budget proposal, he talked about $118 million in cash fund interest. And Kirkmeyer thinks that money could have easily taken care of the $3 million that they're cutting.
So on the one hand, we have these massive cuts to programs that have a direct impact on vulnerable children. And then on the other hand, we have money for new furniture for the legislature. And while both sides have their reasons, the way it looks is just not good. It makes it seem like lawmakers don't really get what everyday Coloradans need.
And that's where we see the public getting really upset online. Social media sites, especially X, are full of criticism aimed at Governor Polis and the senators who voted for SB 188. And there are a lot of strong words being used, like greed and, accusations about hidden millions. It's kind of interesting how many of the same senators who voted for the bill and who will benefit from this new furniture are also the same ones talking about how we have to be responsible with money and cut back on social programs.
It's almost like they're fine with cutting services for other people as long as it doesn't affect them. It doesn't really make you feel very confident in their leadership, does it?
It definitely makes you question where their priorities are. And it feels like a betrayal to a lot of people.
So we've talked about the situation. There are cuts to vital services. Then there's money for new furniture for the legislature. And on top of that, we have this big reserve fund that people say is being mishandled. But to really understand how we got here, we need to look at the bigger picture of Colorado's budget and how Tabor plays into all of this. So we need to talk about Colorado's budget and how Tabor, the taxpayer's Bill of Rights, plays into all of this? I know it's complicated, but just hang in there with us because it's important to understand SB 188 and these, 1,000 bank accounts.
Right. Tabor was passed way back in 1992, and it has really changed the way Colorado handles its money. It basically puts a limit on how much money the state can collect and spend each year. So to raise taxes, they actually need voters to approve it, and that can make it hard to deal with things like rising costs or unexpected shortfalls.
So even if the state wanted to raise taxes to, say, prevent cuts to these programs for children, they would need to go through this whole thing with the voters, right?
Exactly. And that can take a really long time, and you never know what's going to happen. So because the state doesn't have much flexibility to get more money, it has to be creative about how it manages what it already has. And that's where you get these 1,000 bank accounts, these cash funds.
Okay, so these cash funds are basically separate accounts for specific purposes, and they were made as a way to get around the limits set by Tabor.
Exactly. Every single fund has its own rules about how you can use the money. And that might sound organized, but critics say it's not very transparent. It becomes really difficult to track how money is being moved around between these funds and to know if it's actually being used the right way for what it was meant for.
So even though these funds are supposed to be for certain things, is there a chance that money meant for something like education could end up being used for something completely different, and the public wouldn't know because there isn't enough oversight?
That's exactly what people are worried about. And that's why people like Senator Kirkmeyer want more transparency. They say that even though this system probably started with good intentions, it's gotten way too confusing, and there's a chance it could be abused.
It sounds like a situation that just leads to confusion and mistrust, especially with these cuts to programs that are so important for kids.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder if anyone even thought about those programs when they made these budget decisions.
That's a really good question. And it brings up the fact that these budget debates affect real people. It's easy to get caught up in all the numbers and forget that these decisions are impacting people's lives. So let's think about what might happen if they cut $3 million from programs that help at-risk children. These are programs that provide things like therapy, counseling, foster care placement, and early intervention. And these aren't just, extra things. These programs can really change a kid's life, especially when they're facing such huge challenges.
So what will happen to these kids if they cut funding? Like, what are the real-world consequences?
Well, for one thing, there could be a lot less money for things like mental health support. So kids might have to wait longer to get therapy, and their families might have to put off care that they really need. And without the right help, these kids could fall behind in school or get involved in the juvenile justice system or even end up homeless.
That's just awful. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? We're trying to save money by cutting these programs, but ignoring these children could end up costing the state way more in the long run.
I agree. There are studies that show that spending money on early intervention and prevention actually saves money in the long run. When we support these kids early on, we can help them become successful and avoid needing more expensive help later.
So maybe cutting these programs seems like a quick way to fix the budget, but it might actually cause even bigger problems in the future. It's like trying to save a few pennies now, but ending up spending way more later. And even with all these arguments and all the people complaining, the bill still passed. And let's not forget about that $4 million for new furniture. When you think about all these money problems and the fact that they have these 1,000 bank accounts, how do you understand spending that much money on furniture while also cutting programs that help kids in need?
It's a really good question, and a lot of people are confused about it, and it all comes back to priorities.
Right. It's almost like if the lawmakers themselves weren't going to use that furniture, maybe they'd be more likely to question it or even vote against it. But in this case, they were happy to make sure they were comfortable, even if it meant taking away services from people who really need them.
I can see why people would say that. And it really highlights how important it is to have a system that is open and honest so that the public can be sure that their tax dollars are being used in a smart and ethical way.
So we've talked about Tabor and the 1,000 bank accounts and what might happen to children's programs if these cuts happen. But what does all this mean for regular people in Colorado? What happens now? Okay, so we've talked a lot about Colorado Senate Bill 188. We've talked about the budget shortfall and cuts to programs that help children at risk, and then the furniture thing and these mysterious 1,000 bank accounts and the Taxpayer's Bill of Rights, Tabor.
Yeah, it is complicated, with a lot of moving parts. But when it comes down to it, It's all about this question: what do we as a society care about the most?
Yeah, and do the things our elected officials do show what they care about?
Mhm.
Because when I see them voting to cut funding that people really need, while at the same time giving millions of dollars for their own comfort, it makes me feel like something is really wrong.
Right. It makes it seem like there's this big gap between the people in charge and the people they're supposed to be representing.
And it makes people feel really cynical about politics. They see things like this and think they only care about themselves. And honestly, it's hard to blame them for thinking that way.
It's important to remember, though, that these budget decisions actually affect real people's lives, especially people who are already having a hard time. Like those kids who depend on programs that the state pays for, those are the ones who are really going to feel the impact of these decisions made by lawmakers.
And it's not just about what happens right now. It's about the long-term effects on these kids and their families, and basically on everyone.
Exactly. When you cut funding for things like mental health, foster care, and early childhood education, the bad effects can last for generations. It's like we're deciding not to invest in the future.
It's really sad,
Yeah.
because we know that investing in these programs is not only the ethical thing to do, but it actually makes sense financially.
Mm.
When you prevent problems early on, you save money down the road.
You're absolutely right. But sometimes those long-term benefits get lost in the rush to make sure the budget works out right now.
So what can we do about it? How can we as citizens make sure that our voices are heard and that what we think is important is reflected in these decisions that affect our lives?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Don't just believe everything you hear you know. Dig a little deeper and ask questions and make sure your elected officials are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Exactly. Because remember, they work for us. We have a right to know how they're spending our money and why they're making the decisions they make.
That's right. And we have to speak up if we don't agree with something. We can vote or call our representatives or go to town hall meetings or even just talk to our friends and family about these issues. We all have a part to play in making sure our communities are good places to live.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. We want to give you the information you need to be good citizens.
Because when you know things, you have power. And when we understand the issues, we can make better decisions and really fight for the changes that we want.
Well said. We hope this deep dive into SB 188 has helped you understand the situation better and maybe made you think a little more about the decisions our leaders are making.
Just remember, stay curious, stay involved, and keep asking those hard questions. Because the future of Colorado, and honestly, the future of our whole country, depends on it.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back soon for another deep dive.